In this chapter, you will create a simulation that defines a series of 3 stations and moves 2 customers through those stations. The idea is that the first customer moves through the entire sequence before the second customer starts. That is an unrealistic scenario, but it provides a simplified framework we can use as a base for more complicated models later in the course. Specifically in this chapter, we will declare all the variables we need, define classes for customers and stations, which are the business objects within the simulation, and then we will add stations and assign values to properties. Following that, we will clean up any unneeded objects. Then, with all of that programming in place, we will run the simulation once to make sure it works, and then run it multiple times so that we can see how results vary over time. Almost every VBA code module requires variables to represent values used within the module's procedures. In this case, we will use quite a few variables to store values that include the number of stations in the simulation, the average processing time for each station, and the total time that an individual customer spends in the system. In this movie, I will declare the variables that we will use to represent all those values and more. My sample file is chapter 0202, and that's an Excel workbook you can find in the Chapter 2 folder of the exercise files collection. We will use the data that is displayed on the Sim Setup worksheet later on in this chapter, but for now, I'll press Alt F11 and move to the Visual Basic Editor. In the Visual Basic Editor, I have my code module, which will have the code that we'll run to create the simulation. Also in the background, I have 2 other windows, and those are the Customers class and the Stations class. So if I go to the Window menu and click See Customer, that gives me the definition of and properties for the Customer class. And if I go back to Window and click See Station, then we'll see the same thing for the Station class. I haven't really talked about the Station class that much in detail, but if you want to see the definitions for the objects it contains and their properties, it's right here. Now I'll go ahead and switch back to Code Module 1, so go to Window, Module 1, and we can start defining our variables. At the very top, above the sub main test statement, at the top of the subroutine, you'll see that I have option explicit. Option explicit requires you to declare a variable before you use it in your code. Let's say, for example, that I wanted to store the name of an employee. That could be str, first name. So it's a string, and I represent the first name of that employee. If I were to misspell that variable anywhere in the routine, option explicit would catch it, and unless I accidentally type the name of another variable, then I would get an error saying that the variable was undefined. Option explicit will save you from hours of work chasing down errors because a variable that you think you named correctly displays a 0 when in fact you assigned a value to a different variable, a different spelled variable, earlier in the routine. So believe me, option explicit seems like a lot of work, but it will actually save you a lot of work over the long run. All right, with all of that in mind, let's go ahead and declare our variables. So I'll go under the first comment, and I will declare 4 variables. So dim, and then objc, which will be our customer, so that's as, cCustomer, which is the customer class we created before. Next, we'll have dim, objs as, cStation. So we have our customer and our station object variables. Now we need to define collections to contain them. So dim customers as collection, and enter. And finally, dim stations as collection. Right, that's all of the collections and objects that we need. Next, we can do our loop, random, and processing time variables. So I'll click under the second comment, and I'll enter in 4 more variables. So dim lst counter as long. So that'll be one of our counter variables. Next, we'll do the customer ID counter. So that will be dim l customer ID counter as long. We'll have one more variable of type long, and that will be dim lsta time, so the time spent in the station. as long, and enter. And finally, we will have a random value that will be a single value. So it'll be a single precision floating point number. So that'll be dim SNG rand as single. There we go. Now we need to declare one more variable and assign values to two of the ones that we have available. So I'll declare the variable for the number of stations. That will be dim LN MBR STAS. Using this type of abbreviation allows us to retain readability but save typing as long. And finally, we need to assign the value for the number of stations and initialize the customer counter variable. So I'll click under assign value for number of stations. That is L N MBR STAS equals, and we will draw the value from the sim setup worksheet cell B2. So that'll be worksheets. Then left parentheses, the name of the worksheet is sim setup. So I'll put that in double quotes. Then close the right parentheses, a period, range. So we identify the cell range the value is coming from. In this case, in double quotes, it's B2, period, value. So we're drawing the value from cell B2. Now we can initialize the customer ID counter variable. So I will go under the initialize comment, LCUST ID, CNTR equals 1, and we're done. Just to make sure there are no errors, I will press F5 to ensure the code runs. We won't see any output, but if something's wrong, we will see an error. So I'll press F5, everything ran, so that means everything is either working correctly or something went wrong and we don't know about it yet. In this course of simulations, we are modeling the flow of customers through a sandwich shop. This process has two main elements, customers and stations. In this movie, I will review the structure of the customers class, and then I'll use VBA to create an instance of a customer object and add the customer object to the customers collection. My sample file is chapter 0203, and that's a workbook you can find in the chapter 2 folder of the exercise files collection. The data on the sim setup worksheet all refers to stations, which we won't be addressing in this movie. So I'll press Alt F11 to move directly to the Visual Basic Editor. In the Visual Basic Editor, I have arranged the windows so that the customer class module is in front. That way we can scroll through and review its structure. Although in this case, I'll just remind you that we have 6 variables that are represented by properties. And those are customer ID, station, start time, end time, and then entered and left. With that in mind, I'll go ahead and click the title bar of the Module 1 code module, and I will go down to the bottom of the existing code, but above the end substatement, indicating the end of the subroutine, and start adding new code. The first thing I want to do is to create a new customers collection. So first I will document my process by adding a comment. So I'll type a single quote and then create customers and stations collections. Although in this movie, we'll only do the customers collection. Then enter. And the code to define a collection is set customers equal to new collection. So we now have a collection called customers. And if we go back to the variable declarations at the top, we'll see the customers is of type collection. So when we defined it as a new collection using the set keyword, everything worked. Now we need to add a few more lines of code to create a new customer and add that customer to the customers collection. So between the last line I typed and end sub, I'll add a comment for documentation. So single quote, add a single customer for this round. There we go. Now we need to type in 4 lines of code, and the first will create a new customer object. So I'll do set, then object C, objc, which is a variable we defined at the top as type C customer, equals, then the new keyword, because we're creating an object variable, C customer, and that will create our customer. Now we need to add that to the customers collection. So we'll do customers.add using the add method for this particular object, the collections object. Then a space, and we're adding objc, which is the customer we just created. Then enter. Now we need to assign the customer an ID and also the start time. We have already initialized the customer counter variable to 1, as you can see here on this line of code, so we can assign that value to the customer ID. And that code is customers. And then in parentheses, we're identifying the customer, and that is the customer ID counter. So L, CUST ID, CNTR, then close the parentheses, period. CUST ID, which is the property we're affecting, equals, and we're assigning the same value. So L, CUST ID, CNTR. And finally, we need to give the customer a start time. We'll start the customer at 0. So I will copy everything up to the period in the previous line, so I don't have to retype. Dot start time equals 0. So what we've done is create a new customers collection and created an instance of a customer, added it to the collection, and assigned values to 2 of its properties. Just to make sure I don't have any obvious errors, I'll press F5 to run the code. We won't see any output, but hopefully we won't see an error message either. So I'll press F5, everything ran, and it looks like we're good.